We're seeing a lot of regulation recently around child protection, both from the data privacy angle as well as like consumer protection and online safety. So rather than canter through from west to east, I'll talk through some of the trends that we're seeing in three main areas. So some fundamental questions, some around how parent-oriented child protection should be, and then others around what is actually regulated. So the first is actually, what is a child? And that sounds like it should be really straightforward, but is actually quite difficult. And it's quite difficult to operationalize that when you're trying to launch a product in over 200 markets. We've seen that in the UK and the EU, we have sort of different ages, 13 to 16 for consent, but the age-appropriate design code applies to minors under 18. So we've got different standards even internally. The US, we have standards with the Child Online Privacy Protection Act under COPPA, so 13 for under 13s for consent, but many state laws are now looking at 18s for certain uses. So the question is, how do you actually build systems that will work and identify it? One of the interesting examples we've seen recently is in Korea, which actually has changed the age of a juvenile from 18 to 19. And done it in quite an interesting way. So if you're born at any part in the year, you're 19 for that whole year. So for example, if I was turning 19 today, I would have been 19 from the 1st of January under that law. So how do you talk to product teams around these quite nuanced and niche and quite difficult concepts and make that scalable in all of your different markets which don't have the same approach? So the first is we're seeing a lot of variation on these fundamental questions. The second is just about how parent-oriented the approach should be. So obviously a lot of people are coming at it. It is the child, the best interest of the child is the standard in the UN Convention. And it's just trying to understand how you operationalize that. In the UK, the Age-Appropriate Design Code here, we have sort of 15 standards that walk through it. The Irish Children's Fundamentals takes a similar approach. And then the US, California has just adopted its Age-Appropriate Design Code that'll come into force next year, and I know there's a session on that later on, but the idea is that the child has the right to privacy, and we should be protecting the children and not allowing access, so that comes with default settings that are quite high, even vis-a-vis guardians and parents. So parents will have the option to consent, but might not necessarily have the option to review the communications in the chat. And that's quite different now from how some US states are approaching it. So for example, in Utah, there's quite a famous social media regulation act that's gotten a lot of attention recently, which, imposes, among other things, imposes a curfew on children in Utah from 10:30 to 6:30 to using social media, which is just technically quite a lot to work through, but also allows parents to access the communications of their children, which is quite different from how we approach things here. So we've looked at sort of these fundamental questions around age. We're seeing different elements of parent-oriented approaches. And the last thing to talk through in the sort of trend is just what exactly is regulated. So we're seeing a lot in the US states about social media being regulated. Arkansas, Louisiana have sort of laws on the books that are coming into force. Different states, it's passing through their different state legislatures. So trying to understand what exactly is social media anyway. It's hard to find that definition and make it work. And it has been different in different states. So how do you actually operationalize that? Same issue for adult websites and adult content. There's that US Supreme Court case that was I know it when I'll see it. That doesn't really work if you're a games developer or if you're trying to launch platforms to children and actually help. And that's been a big debate in Singapore that has the sort of draft code of practice on protecting children. There is this idea of visibility and minimizing harms, but what are the social media sites that are regulated there? And what sort of safety information should be sort of conveyed to children? So lots of questions, I think, at the moment, and trying to actually make sure that these work for developers and for international products. And then on the enforcement side, we are starting to see regulators really look into this and really focus. And the focus has been on parental consent, transparency, and a bit more on lawful basis. So on parental consent, we had last year the FTC in the US fining Epic Games, the maker of Fortnite, $520 million. Part of that was around failure to get valid and demonstrable parental consents under COPPA. Another part of that was on using dark patterns, so looking into deceptive design to try to ensure or try to get children to make purchases using parents' credit cards, and this sort of issues we're seeing quite a lot of. The EDPB has come up with their own guidance on dark patterns, but I expect that will be an enforcement trend in the future. We've seen a lot focus on TikTok as well. That's sort of making its way through the EDPB process at the moment from the Irish regulator. Here, there's been a lot of focus on that. The ICR recently issued its fine for just over £12 million, looking at consent and transparency issues. And in Korea, we've also seen a focus there on parental consent in enforcement. So a lot going on, and just I think the key point is it's trying to make sure that you are with the product team early so that you can have a sort of scalable and successful product that does comply across these different jurisdictions.